To the Daily Chronicle by Oscar Wilde. This letter appeared in the Daily Chronicle under the heading, "The Case of Warder Martin, Some Cruelties of Prison Life," on 28 May, but it was presumably begun on or soon after the 24th, when the Daily Chronicle printed a letter from Warder Martin recounting the circumstances of his dismissal, and added an editorial comment. "We are, of course, unable to verify our correspondent's statement, but we print his letter." On the 28th, Wilde's letter was backed up by 2 leading articles, and another letter from Martin discussing the Home Secretary's denial, in reply to a question from Michael Davitt, that the facts were as Martin had stated them. To the editor of the Daily Chronicle, published 28 May 1897. Sir, I learn with great regret through the columns of your paper that the Warden Martin of Reading Prison has been dismissed by the prison commissioners for having given some sweet biscuits to a little hungry child. I saw the 3 children myself on the Monday preceding my release. They had just been convicted and were standing in a row in the central hall in their prison dress, carrying their sheets under their arms previous to their being sent to the cells allotted to them. I happened to be passing along one of the galleries on my way to the reception room, where I was to have an interview with a friend. They were all quite small children. The youngest, the one to whom the warder had gave the biscuits, being a tiny little chap, for whom had evidently been unable to find clothes small enough to fit. I had, of course, seen many children in prison during the 2 years which I was myself confined. Wandsworth Prison especially contained always a large number of children, but the little child I saw on the afternoon of Monday the 17th at Reading was tinier than any one of them. I need not say how utterly distressed I was to see these children at Reading, for I knew the treatment in store for them. The cruelty that is practiced by day and night on children in English prisons is incredible, except to those that have witnessed it and are aware of the brutality of the system. People nowadays do not understand what cruelty is. They regard it as a sort of terrible medieval passion, and connect it with the race of men like Echelon de Romano and others, to whom the deliberate infliction of pain gave a real madness of pleasure. But men of the stamp of Echelon are merely abnormal types of perverted individualism. Ordinary cruelty is simply stupidity. It is the entire want of imagination. It is the result in our days of stereotyped systems, of hard and fast rules, and of stupidity. Wherever there is centralization, there is stupidity. What is inhuman in modern life is officialism. Authority is as destructive to those who exercise it as it is to those on whom it is exercised. It is the prison board and the system that it carries out that is the primary source of the cruelty that is exercised on a child in prison. The people who uphold the system have excellent intentions. Those who carry it out are humane in intention also. Responsibility is shifted onto the disciplinary regulations. It is supposed that because a thing is the rule, it is right. The present treatment of children is terrible, primarily from people not understanding the peculiar psychology of a child's nature. A child can understand a punishment inflicted by an individual, such as a parent or guardian, and bear it with a certain amount of acquiescence. What it cannot understand is a punishment inflicted by society. It cannot realize what society is. With grown people, it is of course the reverse. Those of us who are either in prison or have been sent there can understand and do understand what that collective force called society means, and whatever we may think of its methods or claims, we can force ourselves to accept it. Punishment inflicted on us by an individual, on the other hand, is a thing that no grown person endures or is expected to endure. The child, consequently, being taken away from its parents by people whom it has never seen, and of whom it knows nothing, and finding itself in a lonely and unfamiliar cell, waited on by strange faces, and ordered about and punished by the representatives of a system that it cannot understand, becomes an immediate prey to the first and most prominent emotion produced by modern prison life, the emotion of terror. The terror of a child in prison is quite limitless. I remember once in Reading, as I was going out to exercise, seeing in the dimly lit cell right opposite my own a small boy. Two warders, not unkindly men, were talking to him with some sternness apparently, or perhaps giving him some useful advice about his conduct. One was in the cell with him, the other was standing outside. The child's face was like a white wedge of sheer terror. There was in his eyes the terror of a hunted animal. The next morning I heard him at breakfast time crying and calling to be let out. His cry was for his parents. From time to time I could hear the deep voice of the warder on duty telling him to keep quiet, yet he was not even convicted of whatever little offense he had been charged with. He was simply on remand. That I knew by his wearing his own clothes, which seemed neat enough. He was, however, wearing prison socks and shoes. This showed me that he was a very poor boy, whose own shoes, if he had any, were in a bad state. Justices and magistrates, an entirely ignorant class as a rule, often remand children for a week, and then perhaps remit whatever sentence they are entitled to pass. They call this not sending a child to prison. It is, of course, a stupid view on their part. To a little child, whether he is in prison on remand or after conviction, is not a subtlety of social position he can comprehend. To him, the horrible thing is to be there at all. In the eyes of humanity, it should be a horrible thing for him to be there at all. This terror that seizes and dominates the child, as it seizes the grown man, also, is of course intensified beyond power of expression by the solitary cellular system of our prisons. Every child is confined to its cell for 23 hours out of the 24. This is the appalling thing. To shut up a child in a dimly lit cell for 23 hours out of the 24 is an example of the cruelty of stupidity. If an individual, parent or guardian, did this to a child, he would be severely punished. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children would take the matter up at once. There would be on all hands the utmost detestation of whomsoever had been guilty of such cruelty. A heavy sentence would undoubtedly follow conviction. But our own actual society does worse itself, and to the child to be so treated by a strange abstract force, of whose claims it has no cognizance, is much worse than it would be to receive the same treatment from its father or mother, or someone it knew. The inhuman treatment by society is to the child the more terrible because there is no appeal. A parent or guardian can be moved and let out a child from the dark, lonely room in which it is confined, but a warder cannot. Most warders are very fond of children, but the system prohibits them from rendering the child any assistance. Should they do so, as Warder Martin did, they are dismissed. The second thing from which a child suffers in prison is hunger. The food that is given to it consists of a piece of usually badly baked prison bread and a tin of water for breakfast, and at 7:30. At 12 o'clock it gets dinner, composed of a tin of coarse Indian meal stirabout, and at 5:30 it gets a piece of dry bread and a tin of water for its supper. This diet, in the case of a strong grown man, is always productive of the illness of some kind, chiefly, of course, diarrhea with its attendant weakness. In fact, in a big prison, astringent medicines are served out regularly by the warders as a matter of course. In the case of a child, the child is as a rule incapable of eating the food at all. Anyone who knows anything about children knows how easily a child's digestion is upset by a fit of crying, or trouble and mental distress of any kind. A child who has been crying all day long, and perhaps half the night, in a lonely, dimly lit cell, and is preyed upon by terror, simply cannot eat food of this coarse, horrible kind. In the case of the little child to whom Warder Martin gave the biscuits, the child was crying with hunger on Tuesday morning, and utterly unable to eat the bread and water served to it for its breakfast. Martin went out after the breakfast had been served, and brought the few sweet biscuits for the child, rather than see it starving. It was a beautiful action on his part, and was so recognized by the child, who, utterly unconscious of the regulation of the prison board, told one of the senior warders how kind this junior warder had been to him. The result was, of course, a report and a dismissal. I know Martin extremely well, and I was under his charge for the last 7 weeks of my imprisonment. On his appointment at Reading, he had charge of Gallery C, in which I was confined, so I saw him constantly. I was struck by the singular kindness and humanity of the way in which he spoke to me and to the other prisoners. Kind words are much in prison, and a pleasant good morning or good evening will make one as happy as one can be in a prison. He was always gentle and considerate. I happen to know another case in which he showed great kindness to one of the prisoners, and I have no hesitation in mentioning it. One of the most horrible things in prison is the badness of the sanitary arrangements. No prisoner is allowed, under any circumstances, to leave his cell after 5:30 p.m. If consequently he is suffering from diarrhea, he has to use his cell as a latrine, and pass the night in a most fetid and unwholesome atmosphere. Some days before my release, Martin was going the rounds at 7:30 with one of the senior warders for the purpose of collecting the opium and tools of the prisoners. A man just convicted and suffering from violent diarrhea in consequence of the food, as is always the case, asked the senior warder to allow him to empty the slops in his cell on the account of the horrible odor of the cell and the possibility of illness again in the night. The senior warder refused absolutely. It was against the rules. The man had to pass the night in this dreadful condition. Martin, however, rather than see this wretched man in such a loathsome predicament, said he would empty the man's slops himself, and did so. A warder emptying a prisoner's slops is of course against the rules, but Martin did this act of kindness to the man out of the simple humanity of his nature, and the man was naturally most grateful. As regards the children, a great deal has been talked and written lately about the contaminating influence of prisons on young children. What is said is quite true. A child is utterly contaminated by prison life, but the contaminating influence is not that of the prisoners. It is that of the whole prison system, of the governor, the chaplain, the warders, the lonely cell, the isolation, the revolt food, the rules of the prison commissioners, the mode of discipline, that is termed of the life. Every care is taken to isolate a child from the sight even of all prisoners over 16 years of age. Children sit behind a curtain in chapel and are sent to take exercise in small sunless yards, sometimes a stone yard, sometimes a yard at the back of the mills, rather than that they should see the elder prisoners at exercise. But the only really humanizing influence in prison is the influence of the prisoners. Their cheerfulness under terrible circumstances, their sympathy for each other, their humility, their gentleness, their pleasant smiles of greeting when they meet each other, their complete acquiescence in their punishments are all quite wonderful, and I myself learned many sound lessons from them. I am not proposing that the children should not sit behind a curtain in chapel, or that they should take exercise in a corner of the common yard. I am merely pointing out that the bad influence on children is not and could never be that of the prisoners, but is and will always remain that of the prison system itself. There is not a single man in Reading jail that would not gladly have done the 3 children's punishment for them. When I saw them last, it was on the Tuesday following their conviction. I was taking exercise at 11:30 with about 12 other men, as the 3 children passed near us in charge of a warder from the damp, dreary stone yard in which they had been at their exercise. I saw the greatest pity and sympathy in the eyes of my companions as they looked at them. Prisoners are as a class extremely kind and sympathetic to each other. Suffering and the community of suffering makes people kind, and day after day, as I tramped the yard, I used to feel with pleasure and comfort what Carlyle calls somewhere the silent, rhythmic charm of human companionship. In this, as in all other things, philanthropists and people of that kind are astray. It is not the prisoners who need reformation, it is the prisons. Of course, no child under 14 years of age should be sent to prison at all. It is an absurdity, and like many absurdities, of absolutely tragic results. If, however, they are to be sent to prison, During the daytime, they should be in a workshop or schoolroom with a warder. At night, they should sleep in a dormitory. With a night warder to look after them, they should be allowed to exercise for at least 3 hours a day. The dark, badly ventilated, ill-smelling prison cells are dreadful for a child, dreadful indeed for anyone. One is always breathing bad air in prison. The food given to children should consist of tea and bread and butter and soup. Prison soup is very good and wholesome. A resolution of the House of Commons could settle the treatment of children in half an hour. I hope you will use your influence to have this done. The way that children are treated at present is really an outrage on humanity and common sense. It comes from stupidity. Let me draw attention now to another terrible thing that goes on in English prisons. Indeed, in prisons all over the world where the system of silent cellular confinement is practiced, I refer to the large number of men who become insane or weak-minded in prison. In convict prisons, this is of course quite common, but in ordinary jails also, such as that I was confined in, it is to be found. About 3 months ago, I noticed amongst the prisoners who took exercise with me a young man who seemed to me to be silly or half-witted. Every prison, of course, has its half-witted clients, who return again and again and may be said to live in the prison. But this young man struck me as being more than usually half-witted on account of his silly grin and idiotic laughter to himself and the peculiar restlessness of his eternally twitching hands. He was noticed by all the other prisoners on account of the strangeness of his conduct. From time to time, he did not appear at exercise, which showed me that he was being punished by confinement to his cell. Finally, I discovered that he was under observation and being watched night and day by a warden. When he did appear at exercise, he always seemed hysterical and used to walk round crying or laughing. At chapel, he had to sit right under the observation of 2 warders, who carefully watched him all the time. Sometimes he would bury his head in his hands, an offense against the chapel regulations, and his head would be immediately struck up by a warder, so that he should keep his eyes fixed permanently in the direction of the communion table. Sometimes he would cry, not making any disturbance, but with tears streaming down his face and an hysterical throbbing in the throat. Sometimes he would grin idiot-like to himself and make faces. He was on more than one occasion sent out of chapel to his cell, and of course he was continually punished. As the bench on which I used to sit in chapel was directly behind the bench at the end of which this unfortunate man was placed, I had full opportunity of observing him. I also saw him, of course, at exercise continually, and I saw that he was becoming insane and was being treated as if he was shamming. On Saturday week last, I was in my cell at about 1 o'clock, occupied in cleaning and polishing the tins I had been using for dinner. Suddenly I was startled by the prison silence being broken by the most horrible and revolting shrieks, or rather howls, for at first I thought some animal like a bull or a cow was being unskillfully slaughtered outside the prison walls. I soon realized, however, that the howls proceeded from the basement of the prison, and I knew that some wretched man was being flogged. I need not say how hideous and terrible it was for me, and I began to wonder who it was who was being punished in this revolting manner. Suddenly it dawned upon me that they might be flogging this unfortunate lunatic. My feelings on the subject need not to be chronicled. They have nothing to do with the question. The next day, Sunday 16th, I saw the poor fellow at exercise. His weak, ugly, wretched face, bloated by tears and hysteria, almost beyond recognition. He walked in the center ring along with the old men, the beggars, and the lame people, so that I was able to observe him the whole time. It was my last Sunday in prison, a perfectly lovely day, the finest day we had had the whole year. And there in the beautiful sunlight walked this poor creature, made once in the image of God, grinning like an ape, and making with his hands the most fantastic gestures, as though he was playing in the air on some invisible stringed instrument, or arranging and dealing counters in some curious game. All the while, these hysterical tears, without which none of us ever saw him, were making soiled runnels on his white, swollen face. The hideous and deliberate grace of his gestures made him like an antic. He was a living grotesque. The other prisoners all watched him, and not one of them smiled. Everybody knew what had happened to him, and that he was being driven insane, was insane already. After half an hour, after half an hour, he was being driven insane, was insane already. After half an hour, he was ordered in by the warder and I suppose punished. At least he was not at exercise on Monday, though I think I caught sight of him at the corner of the stone yard, walking in charge of a warder. On the Tuesday, my last day in prison, I saw him at exercise. He was worse than before and again was sent in. Since then, I know nothing of him, but I found out from one of the prisoners who walked with me at exercise that he had 24 lashes in the cookhouse on Saturday afternoon, by order of the visiting justices on the report of the doctor. The howls that had horrified us were all his. This man is undoubtedly becoming insane. Prison doctors have no knowledge of mental disease of any kind. They are, as a class, ignorant men. The pathology of the mind is unknown to them. When a man grows insane, they treat him as shamming. They have punished him again and again. Naturally, the man becomes worse. When ordinary punishments are exhausted, the doctor reports the case to the justices. The result is flogging. Of course, the flogging is not done with a cat o' nine tails. It is what is called birching. The instrument is a rod, but the result on the wretched half-witted man may be imagined. His number is or was A211. I also managed to find out his name. It is Prince. Something should be done at once for him. He is a soldier, and his sentence is one of court-martial. The term is 6 months. 3 have yet to run. May I ask you to use your influence to have this case examined into, and to see that the lunatic prisoner is properly treated? No report by the medical commissioners is of any avail. It is not to be trusted. The medical inspectors do not seem to understand the difference between idiocy and lunacy, between the entire absence of a function or organ and the disease of a function or organ. This man, A211, will, I have no doubt, be able to tell his name, the nature of his offense, the day of month, the date of the beginning of expiration of his sentence, and answer any ordinary simple question. But that his mind is diseased admits of no doubt. At present, it is a horrible duel between himself and the doctor. The doctor is fighting for a theory. The man is fighting for his life. I am anxious that the man should win, but let the whole case be examined into by experts who understand brain diseases and by people of humane feelings who have still some common sense and some pity. There is no reason that the sentimentalist should be asked to interfere. He always does harm. The case is a special instance of the cruelty inseparable from a stupid system, for the present governor of Reading is a man of gentle and humane character, greatly liked and respected by all the prisoners. He was appointed in July last, and though he cannot alter the rules of the prison system, he has altered the spirit in which they used to be carried out under his predecessor. He is very popular with the prisoners and with the warders. Indeed, he has quite altered the whole tone of the prison life. Upon the other hand, the system is of course beyond his reach as far as altering its rules is concerned. I have no doubt that he sees daily much of what he knows to be unjust, stupid, and cruel, but his hands are tied. Of course, I have no knowledge of his real views of the case of A211, not indeed of his real views on our present system. I merely judge him by the complete change he brought about in Reading Prison. Under his predecessor, the system was carried out with the greatest harshness and stupidity. I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Oscar Wilde. This letter appeared in the Daily Chronicle under the heading, "Don't read this if you want to be happy today," on 24 March, when the House of Commons began the debate on the second reading of the Prison Bill. The bill introduced some of the improvements suggested by Wilde and became law in August as the Prison Act. To the editor of the Daily Chronicle, published 24 March 1898. Sir, I understand that the Home Secretary's Prison Reform Bill is to be read this week for the first or second time, and as your journal has been the one paper in England that has taken a real and vital interest on this important question, I hope that you will allow me, as one who has long personal experience of life in an English jail, to point out what reforms in our present stupid and barbarous system are urgently necessary. From a leading article that appeared in your columns about a week ago, I learned that the chief reform proposed is an increase in the number of inspectors and official visitors that are to have access to our English prisons. Such a reform as this is entirely useless. The reason is extremely simple. The inspectors and justices of the peace that visit prisons come there for the purpose of seeing that the prison regulations are duly carried out. They come for no other purpose, nor have they any power, even if they had the desire, to alter a single clause in the regulations. No prisoner has ever had the smallest relief or attention or care from any of the official visitors. The visitors arrive not to help the prisoners, but to see that the rules are carried out. Their object in coming is to ensure the enforcement of a foolish and inhumane code, and, as they must have some occupation, they take very good care to do it. A prisoner who has been allowed the smallest privilege dreads the arrival of the inspectors, and on the day of any prison inspection, the prison officials are more than usually brutal to the prisoners. Their object is, of course, to show the splendid discipline they maintain. The necessary reforms are very simple. They concern the needs of the body and the needs of the mind of each unfortunate prisoner. With regard to the first, there are three permanent punishments authorized by law in English prisons: 1. Hunger; 2. Insomnia; 3. Disease. The food supplied to prisoners is entirely inadequate. Most of it is revolting in character, all of it is insufficient. Every prisoner suffers day and night from hunger. A certain amount of food is carefully weighed out, ounce by ounce for each prisoner. It is just enough to sustain, not life exactly, but existence. But one is always racked by the pain and sickness of hunger. The result of the food, which in most cases consists of weak gruel, suet, and water, is disease in the form of incessant diarrhea. This malady, which ultimately with most prisoners becomes a permanent disease, is a recognized institution in every prison. At Wandsworth Prison, for instance, where I was confined for 2 months, till I had to be carried into hospital, where I remained for another 2 months, the warders go round twice or 3 times a day with astringent medicines, which they serve out to the prisoners as a matter of course. After about a week of such treatment, it is unnecessary to say that the medicine produces no effect at all. The wretched prisoner is then left a prey to the most weakening, depressing, and humiliating malady that can be conceived. And if, as often happens, he fails from physical weakness to complete his required revolutions at the crank or the mill, he is reported for idleness and punished with the greatest severity and brutality. Nor is this all. Nothing can be worse than the sanitary arrangements of English prisons. In old days, each cell was provided with a form of latrine. These latrines have now been suppressed, they exist no longer. A small tin vessel is supplied to each prisoner instead. 3 times a day, a prisoner is allowed to empty his slops, but he is not allowed to have access to the prison lavatories, except during the 1 hour when he is at exercise. And after 5 o'clock in the evening, he is not allowed to leave a cell under any pretense or for any reason. A man suffering from diarrhea is consequently placed in a position so loathsome that it is unnecessary to dwell on it, that it would be unseemly to dwell on it. The misery and tortures that prisoners go through in consequence of the revolting sanitary arrangements are quite indescribable, and the foul air of the prison cells, increased by a system of ventilation that is utterly ineffective, is so sickening and unwholesome that it is no uncommon thing for warders, when they come in the morning out of the fresh air and open and inspect each cell, to be violently sick. I have seen this myself on more than 3 occasions, and several of the warders have mentioned it to me as one of the disgusting things that their office entails on them. The food supplied to prisoners should be adequate and wholesome. It should not be of such a character as to produce the incessant diarrhea that at first a malady becomes a permanent disease. The sanitary arrangements in English prisons should be entirely altered. Every prisoner should be allowed to have access to the lavatories when necessary, and to empty his slops when necessary. The present system of ventilation in each cell is utterly useless. The air comes through choked up gratings, and through a small ventilator is the tiny barred window, which is far too small and too badly constructed to admit any adequate amount of fresh air. One is only allowed out of one's cell for 1 hour of the 24 that compose the long day, and so for 23 hours one is breathing the foulest possible air. With regard to the punishment of insomnia, it only exists in Chinese and in English prisons. In China, it is inflicted by placing the prisoner in a small bamboo cage. In England, by means of the plank bed. The object of the plank bed is to produce insomnia. There is no other object in it, and it invariably happens in the course of imprisonment. One still suffers from insomnia, for sleep, like all wholesome things, is a habit. Every prisoner who has been on a plank bed suffers from insomnia. It is a revolting and ignorant punishment. With regard to the needs of the mind, I beg that you will allow me to say something. The present prison system seems almost to have for its aim the wrecking and the destruction of mental faculties. The production of insanity is, if not its object, certainly its result. That is a well ascertained fact. It causes not its object certainly, no, its causes are obvious. Deprived of books of all human intercourse, isolated from every humane and humanizing influence, condemned to eternal silence, robbed of all intercourse with the external world, treated like an unintelligent animal, brutalized below the level of any of the brute creation, the wretched man who is confined in an English prison can hardly escape becoming insane. I do not wish to dwell on these horrors, still less to excite any momentary sentimental interest in these matters, so I will merely, with your permission, point out what should be done. Every prisoner should have an adequate supply of good books. At present, during the first 3 months of imprisonment, one is allowed no books at all except a Bible, prayer book, and hymn book. After that, one is allowed 1 book a week. That is not merely inadequate, but the books that compose an ordinary prison library are perfectly useless. They consist chiefly of third-rate, badly written religious books, so-called written apparently for children and utterly unsuitable for children or for anyone else. Prisoners should be encouraged to read and should have whatever books they want, and the books should be well chosen. At present, the selection of books is made by the prison chaplain. Under the present system, a prisoner is only allowed to see his friends 4 times a year, for 20 minutes each time. This is quite wrong. A prisoner should be allowed to see his friends once a month, and for a reasonable time. The mode at present in vogue of exhibiting a prisoner to his friends should be altered. Under the present system, the prisoner is either locked up in a large iron cage or in a large wooden box with a small aperture covered with wire netting, through which he is allowed to peer. His friends are placed in a similar cage, some 3 or 4 feet distant, and 2 warders stand between to listen to, and if they wish, stop or interrupt the conversation, such as it may be. I propose that a prisoner should be allowed to see his relatives or friends in a room. The present regulations are inexpressibly revolting and harassing. A visit from our relatives or friends is to every prisoner an intensification of humiliation and mental distress. Many prisoners, rather than support such an ordeal, refuse to see their friends at all, and I cannot say I am surprised. When one sees one's solicitor, one sees him in a room with a glass door on the other side of which stands the warder. When a man sees his wife and children, or his parents or his friends, he should be allowed the same privilege. To be exhibited like an ape in a cage to people who are fond of one, and of whom one is fond, is a needless and horrible degradation. Every prisoner should be allowed to write and receive a letter at least once a month. At present, one is allowed to write only 4 times a year. This is quite inadequate. One of the tragedies of prison life is that it turns a man's heart to stone. The feelings of natural affection, like all other feelings, require to be fed. They die easily of inanition. A brief letter 4 times a year is not enough to keep alive the gentler and more humane affections by which ultimately the nature is kept sensitive to any fine or beautiful influences that may heal a wrecked and ruined life. The habit of mutilating and expurgating prisoners' letters should be stopped. At present, if a prisoner in a letter makes any complaint of the prison system, that portion of his letter is cut out with a pair of scissors. If, upon the other hand, he makes any complaint when he speaks to his friends through the bars of a cage or the aperture of the wooden box, he is brutalized by the warders and reported for punishment every week till his next visit comes around, by which time he is expected to have learned not wisdom but cunning, and one always learns that. It is one of the few things that one does learn in prison. Fortunately, the other things are in some instances of higher import. If I may trespass for a little longer, may I say this? You suggested, in your leading article, that no prison chaplain should be allowed to have any care or employment outside the prison itself. But this is a matter of no moment. The prison chaplains are entirely useless. They are as a class well-meaning, but foolish, indeed silly men. They are of no help to any prisoner. Once every 6 weeks or so, a key turns in the lock of one's cell door and the chaplain enters. One stands, of course, at attention. He asks whether one has been reading the Bible. One answers yes or no, as the case may be. He then quotes a few texts and goes out and locks the door. Sometimes he leaves a tract. The officials who should not be allowed to hold any employment outside of the prison or to have any private practice are the prison doctors. At present, the prison doctors have usually, if not always, a large private practice and hold appointments in their other institutions. The consequence is that the health of the prisoners is entirely neglected, and that the sanitary condition of the prison entirely overlooked. As a class, I regard, and have always from my earliest youth regarded, doctors as by far the most humane profession in the community. But I must make an exception for prison doctors. They are, as far as I come across them, and from what I saw of them in a hospital and elsewhere, brutal in manner, coarse in temperament, and utterly indifferent to the health of the prisoners and their comfort. If prison doctors were prohibited from private practice, they would be compelled to take some interest in the health and sanitary condition of the people under their charge. I have tried to indicate in my letter a few of the reforms necessary to our English prison system. They are simple, practical, and humane. They are, of course, only a beginning. But it is time that a beginning should be made, and it can only be started by a strong pressure of public opinion, formularized in your powerful paper and fostered by it. But to make even these reforms effectual, much has to be done, and the first and perhaps the most difficult task is to humanize the governors of prisons, to civilize the warders, and to Christianize the chaplains. Yours, etc., the author. of the Ballad of Reading Jail.